Thank you very much. It's a real privilege to be here. I am a very, very proud emergency planner, and I'm very aware that people don't always know what that is. So we make lots of big lists of all of the things that can go wrong, and then we come up with plans to mitigate them or respond when they happen. But more and more, where you find me tends to be in the aftermath and in the rebuild, which is a privilege in itself. I usually end my presentations with a Rebecca Solnit quote, but today I will start with it so that we can hold on to it all of the way through the talk. Disasters sometimes knock down institutions and structures and suspend private life, leaving a broader view of what lies beyond. The task before us is to recognise the possibilities visible through that gate and endeavour to bring them into the realm of the everyday. I also want to declare my own two truths up front, my own ambivalence, that I think any of us based in England and Wales at the moment feel very much similarly. Like all of us, I'm currently in a very complicated, sometimes abusive relationship with my own local National Health Service. I love you, the National Health Service, but you don't always love me back. I can't find a dentist, it takes weeks to seek care. All of my immediate family are on lengthy waiting lists. You treat me for multiple very expensive chronic conditions. You've saved my life twice, my husband's once. You are the reason I have two joyous girls, and the best nights out of my life are with the anatomical pathology technologists. There's a chance that in the first half of the presentation it will feel quite depressing, but I want you to remember at all times that I am indeed an antidote to despair, as per the Daily Mirror. And also, do buy this. I've noticed it's out the front. I'll come and sign it for you. But also, this will make everything make sense. One of the things that I talk about in this book is how I go into an organisation immediately after a disaster has occurred, or sometimes they'll ask me if they've got lots of foresight before the disaster. Where do I go? I sit in their coffee shops, I wander their corridors, I'm looking for shabby notice boards, I'm looking for the staff overtly discussing that everything's gone wrong. And of course, by the virtue of being both a patient and a family member, I've been doing that with the National Health Service for about 10 years. And now the word is out, and the word on the street is collapse. We have, without doubt, if you are truly immersed in the disaster literature, passed what is called the incubation phase, when the first signs of collapse start to show. We are now a mass of interconnected organisations that are struggling. Remember, though, I am an antidote to despair. I'm a pandemic planner, a rare and mythical beast. And what that meant was, from 2004, and I still am, wrote plans for when, never if, our most likely and planned for risk would hit. I also helped to write several of what we call the injects. They're a little bit of the story that go into a disaster exercise where we all get together and we plan and pretend that the disaster has happened and we talk about it, for what was called exercise Cygnus. Remember that I work in the afterwards and not just the acute phase. And Cygnus was an unusual national exercise on pandemic planning in that it looked at the aftermath for the first 3 years. So if you were an experienced pandemic planner in 2020 and had been involved in exercising before, then there have been few surprises over the last few years. The hardest thing has been watching known knowns repeatedly explored. And in those plans and in those injects, we knew that the hardest toll of all in a pandemic disaster would be on our National Health Service. We wrote a reasonable worst case scenario, an RWCS. We wrote it before, and now we get to live it. One of the numbers that sticks in my head is you will have, for every 1 death in the acute phase of some viruses, 5 deaths in the 10 years after from treatable conditions. We went into the pandemic with both the health and social care in a perilous position. As was reported as an expose this weekend, 1 in 7 buildings in the UK were built before 1948. So that means buildings where babies are born, hands are held, life drains away, blood drains away, was built before 1948. We were also, by 2019, kicking a series of workforce cans down the road. Coupled with austerity and exit from the EU, we knew that people would get sicker and iller, they would become more dependent on screens and on alcohol, and that process would start earlier, just as the earlier presentation highlighted. But remember, I'm an antidote to despair. So really, we've reached a stage where all components of institutional collapse are there. Psychological collapse, collapse of trust, physical collapse, literally, workforce collapse, and crucially, ethos collapse. The idea that it won't be there for us is hugely important in the British psyche. So what do we do with all of this? What do we take from the disaster recovery literature to help us with some of this? Well, the first thing to really emphasize is that the resistance was so strong at the start of the pandemic, particularly from the Department of Health, to use the D word. There's been a desperate need to underplay that this was, in fact, a disaster. The dis and the astro, the collision of the bad stars. So one of the lines that when I first put the book out in 2022, people reacted most strongly with, and sometimes quite negatively, was, "We are all disaster survivors now." In February, that became a feature in Elle magazine that has proved to be hugely popular because everybody is embracing the idea that we have been through something that did something. Disaster planners don't have many friends, and they're not popular at dinner parties because we talk quite bluntly. You may have noticed. We are realistic, intentionally bleak, and look for the hidden, latent dominoes. So if I give you an example with flooding, somebody will say to me, there's only 10 houses flooded, and I'll say, but it's only week 1. Secondary flooding appears slowly and malevolently over the first 12 weeks. So it goes from 10 houses to 500. Secondary flooding is kind of when the water leaks into things like under the floors. So there's a real resistance at the moment, but perhaps also a political imperative to not fully vocalize either what we have been through and the impact on us, but also the impact on this great institution. The other thing that I'm doing when I'm preparing an impact assessment is I'm looking at what data I have to tell me what state you're in. And I have all the data I need. I have the inquest reports, the inquiries, the datixes, the litigation, the building safety inspections. This is an organisation or multiple organisations in trouble. But that is what disaster planners do. One of the things that's been proved to be one of the most useful tools for me, and I think for you and also in your personal life, is this recovery graph. Some government departments embraced it, the Department of Health and Social Care. Remember, we weren't in a D, so they didn't want any of the disaster tools. They were a bit slow with this. Disaster planners hate the honeymoon phase, that bit at the beginning. We hate it with a passion. And the sort of things that you will see in the honeymoon phase are things like the clap. For any UK-based health specialists, where everybody else was banging their pans, I was weeping into a corner because what you don't want to do is lean into a hero's narrative that sets up your practitioners for vocational awe and very quickly becomes a villain's narrative. It's difficult to put a time scale on this honeymoon phase, but it's about 12 weeks, or as we call it in folklore now, lockdown 1. You then head into a slump. And although it's very exciting here today, and there's pastries, and there's brilliant energy, we're actually still in the slump. This is an elongated slump. And this is, people are very resistant when they're inside it to believing it. This is a time when remember those latent errors, they really start to show themselves. And what you're left with, which is exactly the energy in this place today, is whether you go for the great exodus, which is we kind of all give up, or whether you go for the great epiphany, which is that you force those Rebecca Solnit changes. And of course, what we're all here about today is that uptick at the end. I don't always see it, but I stay hopeful for it. one of the things about the slump being this long and arduous is that we know that basic reliance on the healthcare system for the most privileged in the UK is also now gone. And that is a real moment. That's when, bluntly, failure gets talked about much more loudly. And essentially people say, I'd heard that it was failing, I'd read it was failing, I just didn't know it was failing for me. One of the important things about the energy here today and looking at some of the presentations is it's really important in this stage to move from slump to uptick, to have no issues off the table, to be very aware that the Titanic can sink and to leave the hubris at the door. Everything at this point for the uptick to be realised needs to be future focused. So there's a few things from disaster literature that we know are where focus needs to be for a rebuild. Firstly, workforce. There's a real pressure and drive sometimes to bring aviation safety into healthcare, but one thing that always forgets is how aviation safety values the pilot. The family around the pilot is nourished, unfatigued, kept safe. It's remediated. This has to be, a second point has to be on infrastructure. Disasters have to begin with rebuild, and space is everything, which is why it's been so lovely to hear about so many architecture projects today. The issues have to be truly non-political. That's one of the nice things about working in disaster, is that they have to be cross-party, everybody signed up to the same place. We have to understand the motivations for private medicine. It is not just about, at the moment, ease, access, speed. It's also about how you are treated in these spaces. And myself and my colleagues, as we're asked more and more now to comment on health issues, are asked more about the kind of ethic of care that is brought into spaces. I tweeted a couple of weekends ago that I have responded to disasters for 24 years. But the worst I've ever seen in terms of treatment of human to human is in maternity units in the UK. We have to look at our motivation for change. The Health Secretary called it the M&S moment, but that is always difficult to accelerate change in very Leviathan-esque public sector organisations. We have to decide, what does good look like? One of the big challenges, I mentioned being a pandemic planner, is we never planned for a no-harm pandemic. We planned, and I mean right down to brass tacks and how many beds, we planned for 800,000 deaths. We have never planned for any of the top 10 risks on our national risk register or any of the risks on our threat assessment to come with no death. So what does good look like? And that apocryphal whiteboard, who do we save? That went from being a standard emergency planning question in 2019 to a horrible, loaded eugenics discussion in 2020, as it should. But those conversations need to be brought out into the open. In disaster response, when you want to see whether good is working and whether things are changing and whether we're getting anywhere near the uptick, you measure tiny, little, incremental changes. One voice is one voice. Let the communities in to the health rebuild. I've worked on the Grenfell disaster for 6 years now, and it has taught me everything about what the NHS calls cultural incompetency, but what I would call institutional racism. It has taught me everything about gatekeeping and boundarying and the misuse of the word co-production when it isn't. It has also allowed me to see some of the most wonderful things I have ever seen in a lifetime. And I always promise the GPs of North Kensington that whenever I do a health event, I will tip my hat to them and their labour and nearly 7 years of constant 24-hour work, and the work that they have done to bring in desperately failed people, and the work that they have done around social prescribing, which I think is a real lesson to us all, and I've started to publish alongside them on that. We need to understand the motivations of litigation in the same way as we understand the motivations of litigation in disaster planning. Litigation is very, very rarely in trauma or tragedy about money. It is because the British system, the only way to bring about change or an apology or a recognition is to attach a sum of money to your loss. So we need to understand both the motivation for litigation and one of the most difficult things to witness, which is the defensiveness in the NHS at the moment and the treatment of people trying to bring about change. We need to use the psychiatric and psychosocial literature on disaster that tells us that mental health will continue to be a major issue for at least the next 30 to 40 years after this disaster. You don't get to buy out of this one. This was the big one. We also therefore see additional comorbidities. Every disaster hit community I ever worked with sees increases in drug and alcohol use, for example. One of the brilliant things about my work, as you can imagine, is I see amazing, authentic action in life after disaster. How else could I do my job? And that's what I'm really looking forward to. And this slump into uptick, of course, carries alongside the day-to-day business. So you can't stop everything and carry on. This guidance is taken from the wonderful New Zealand Leading in Disaster Recovery written by the New Zealand Red Cross that reminds us that recovery after these sorts of events is not a sprint, not a marathon, but the worst kind of endurance event. They ask us, it's a beautiful document, please do download it. We're finding it having so much traction in the health sector. They ask us to look at every action through a lens of disaster survivance. People behave differently and workforces behave differently in this slump. There is a profound urgency. We have seen disaster, all of us now. We are still inside a chronic disaster and we will see disaster again. But as Rebecca says, the only good thing that comes out of a disaster like a pandemic is that it creates one single opportunity to re-examine structures and institutions. I've become cynical about the purpose of any public inquiry to find that narrative, and what I do believe now is that we need something gentler, freer, and genuinely inquisitorial that will allow a true airing of everything that has happened to us. Only going that big gives us any chance of coming back from this. Thank you.